Global National with Donna Friesen.
Across the country, symbols of mourning and grief. From Parliament Hill to provincial legislatures, flags were lowered to half-mast, vigils held, and shoes lined up to represent the up to 215 children whose remains have been found in unmarked graves on the grounds of a former residential school in Kamloops, reopening old wounds for Indigenous families torn apart.
It is a great open secret that our children lie on these properties of former schools. An open secret that Canadians can no longer look away from.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission identified 3,200 deaths of children in residential schools, but the real number is higher. So many records are lacking. Names and genders weren't recorded. Parents weren't informed. The chair of the commission, Murray Sinclair, has said the number of children who died could be as high as 6,000. There were about 140 residential schools across Canada. Indigenous children were forcibly taken from their homes, prohibited from speaking their language or learning their culture. There are now calls to find all the lost children, not just the more than 200 who have been discovered thanks to ground-penetrating radar in unmarked graves in Kamloops. There is a collective sense they and their families deserve more than just lowered flags and empty political promises. Heather Yurix-West has our top story tonight.
Alan Knockwood was a young child when he was taken from his family and forced to live in a residential school.
We were punished for any hint of disobedience. I was 9 years old and they took my hands out like this, and I had 10 hits on each hand with the strap. And it caused my hands to swell up to the point where I couldn't move them.
Still, Knockwood says he considers himself lucky. He survived. At least 215 children in Kamloops did not. And across the country, Indigenous community members believe there are many more victims that remain unaccounted for.
There was a lot of first-degree murders that happened in those schools. So it triggered a lot of emotions for thousands of people right across this country.
In Saskatchewan, the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations say it's time to conduct radar ground searches at residential school sites across the province. Near Calgary, the Siksika Nation is asking an investigation be carried out at every site across the country.
I had to take a drive and have a good cry. Out of that remembering, but also being grateful to these children that were found. And the probability of finding children here too, around this school.
The past few days have been traumatizing for survivors like Butch Wolfleg, remembering not only those who died at the schools, but in the years since they came home.
Their way of dealing with this trauma is through addictions, dulling the pain. And a lot of them died while they were dulling the pain.
Speaking about such a painful past is not easy. For many survivors, it's not something they often do. But there is also a deep need to ensure these stories are told, so that moving forward there can be peace and justice that is just not possible without accountability and truth. Heather Yurix-West, Global News, Calgary.
Today, BC Premier John Horgan addressed the discovery at the former residential school in Kamloops. He says he was horrified when he heard the news and says making amends is the least his government can do.
We're a proud people. We've done extraordinary things together, but we've also done atrocious things together. And collectively, we have a responsibility to face that head on. And after the discovery of a mass grave in Kamloops, it's more real now than ever before.
There is renewed pressure on the federal government to help find all the lost graves of Indigenous children who died at residential schools. And this is far from the first call to action. As David Aiken reports, the Trudeau government is now being urged to do more to fulfill key recommendations made by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
As a dad, I can't imagine what it would feel like to have my kids taken away from me. And as Prime Minister, I am appalled by the shameful policy that stole Indigenous children from their communities.
Campaigning to be Prime Minister in 2015, Justin Trudeau promised he would implement all 94 recommendations made by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, including 6 that had to do with missing children and burial information. Things like creating a national register of student deaths, a register of burial places, and funding burial ceremonies and commemorations.
Those calls to action have not been fully implemented. So that's the frustration. Like, you have a report. We don't want it gathering dust.
The commission did a lot of work to figure out how many children died and where they are buried, but some work was left undone when the Harper government turned down a request by the commission for an extra $1.5 million to help locate missing cemeteries. It would not be until 2019 when the Trudeau government set aside funds, about $34 million, to implement the 6 commission recommendations on burial sites of children.
They need to fully fund the work that needs to be done to identify the unmarked graves of children across Canada, because there are many, many more.
But as of this week, the status of all the commission recommendations involving Ottawa is unfinished, incomplete. Talks continue.
So far, there's a lot of distance between their statements and their actions towards children. And we need to be watching carefully their actions.
We've got to grieve this moment, but for the federal government, it's not good enough to just continue with symbolic gestures.
Trudeau responded to that Monday.
We promised concrete action, and that's how we'll support survivors, families, and Indigenous peoples.
Now, Trudeau would not say what he means by concrete action. That could take a couple of days to work out. But in the meantime, MPs agreed unanimously to hold an urgent debate on this issue tomorrow. Donna?
David, a lot of people say it's time for less talk, more action. Advocates like Cindy Blackstock say one concrete action could be to end these court battles involving residential school survivors and Indigenous children. What's the likelihood of that?
Well, I asked Trudeau about that today, and it doesn't sound to me like the government of Canada is going to back off 3 court cases it has ongoing. One of those involves residential school survivors at St. Anne's School in Northern Ontario. And this school, by the way, is a school where they used an electric chair to punish the kids. And St. Anne's survivors have had to go to court to get Canada to turn over documents about how the kids there were cared for. The other 2 cases involved care of the current generation of Indigenous kids. Ottawa's appealing a couple of human rights rulings. One of those cases is in court in a couple of weeks. But you're right, advocates and some parliamentarians say Ottawa should just drop all 3 of these legal cases and get on with the task of caring for survivors and the current generation of Indigenous kids. Donna?
All right, David Akin, thanks. The NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh, says the federal government needs to make some tough decisions about its commitment to remedy the injustice of the residential school system. And this was his answer when he was asked what message he has for the families who lost children.
I'm sorry. We're going to fight for justice for you.
So many people are at a loss for words. The school in Kamloops was run by the Catholic Church, and there are renewed calls for the church to apologize for its role in the residential school system. The Pope has stopped short of doing that. Today, the president of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops released a statement saying, "I express our deepest sorrow for the heartrending loss of the children at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. As we see ever more clearly the pain and suffering of the past, the Bishops of Canada pledge to continue walking side by side with Indigenous peoples in the present, seeking greater healing and reconciliation for the future." Across the country, personal stories are being shared about the impact of residential schools. We want to share a powerful speech delivered by Indigenous MP Romeo Saganash. It was back in 2014, but it still resonates today. He made the speech while calling for a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. And he recalled his own brother's death in a residential school.
Let me tell you a little story, Mr. Speaker, about a little boy named Johnish, who was sent to residential school in 1954. He was 5 years old, never came back, apparently died the first year he arrived in residential school. His mom, Mr. Speaker, his mom never knew till after 2 years of his death. His mom, my mom, for 40 years never knew where John Ish was buried. For 40 years, Mr. Speaker. And it is only by coincidence one day that one of my sisters happened to be in the area, and someone told her, I know where your little brother is buried. So after 40 years, my sister filmed the site where he was buried, brought the film back to my mom to show her. I saw my mother cry many times. But the day she saw that video, I had never seen her cry that way. That's closure, Mr. Speaker. That's what we call closure.
There is some support for survivors. A 24-hour crisis line is available for anyone experiencing pain or distress as a result of their residential school experience. They can call toll-free and speak in confidence. The number is 1-866-925-4419.